Hello, class. As I mentioned earlier this week, what I'm going to start doing is, sometimes it can be hard to study for a final exam. I fully realize that. And as I've already stated, the final exam for this class is 100% essay. Though it'd be anywhere between as few as five and as many as nine or 10 essay questions that cover the entire class. So what I figured I would do is for each chapter that you read in the book, I'm going to highlight for you what I consider to be the major points. Now, I still encourage you to read the entire chapter, and because again, there's a lot of good information in there, and the more you learn, each chapter, adds and builds upon itself. But I thought it was important for you to be able to have some kind of highlights, if you will, that I think are important. So I'll start with chapter one, which is kind of basically just an introduction to labor relations itself. I believe it's table 1.2 in chapter one that talks about the pros and cons of unionization. I know in one of our discussion forums we already kind of discussed this, but again, that part of the textbook does a good job of talking about the pros of unionization and the cons of unionization, specifically as it relates to members of a union, how it relates to management, and then what is society as a whole? What are the pros and cons to society as a whole? So really study that table. I'm not expecting you to memorize it. There's no memorization on the final exam, but understand, kind of, especially when it comes to things like wages and terms and conditions of employment, and other little perks and long-term growth opportunity. Things like that are what you want to focus on. So make sure that you look at the pros and cons of unionization. And again, table 1.2 in chapter one is a kind of a good overall summary of that. Next, I want you to look at some growth opportunity industries. While unionization as a whole, as you've read, is declining in the U.S. and it has been for quite some time, there are still some areas of growth for unions. And the four that I really want to touch on, one is hospitality. And I'll kind of do one and two, hospitality and casinos. And to me, this is very close to my heart because, again, I work in higher education now, but when I graduated undergrad, the first 6 years of my life was spent in the casino world. I worked in human resources in 4 different states for the same company in casinos and hospitality, hotels, restaurants, things like that. So, and unionization is very, very heavy in that industry, especially with like house cleaners and front desk clerks and dealers and slot technicians. All those kind of positions are heavily unionized. So make sure you read in the textbook the details about the hospitality and the casino industry and how unionization affects those. Airlines is another one where unionization is still very heavy. The pilots have a very strong union. The flight attendants have a very strong union. All the mechanics who work on the planes are very heavily unionized. And you've probably seen in the media the last couple of months. We all know that airline fees and ticket prices are skyrocketing, and you've probably seen a lot of time where pilots are picketing. I think United Airlines just went through a pilot strike because of the conditions. There's so few pilots right now, and then they're having to work extra hours, and it's really putting a stress on their jobs. So the unions have been very active in the airline industry because of kind of what's happening in our economy. So pay very close attention to that. And then finally, the healthcare industry, particularly among jobs like technicians and nurses. In my current role now at the University of Illinois, when I'm working, I work very heavily with the Illinois Nurses Association, which is the union that represents all nurses in the Chicago area. So there's a lot of unionization in hospitals, but again, nurses is one of the big ones. So hospitality, casinos, airlines, and healthcare are 4 big areas where there's still a lot of growth opportunity for unionization right now. Also, for chapter one, make sure you know the differences between craft unions and industrial unions. We talked about that during the first week about kind of the details of what those are at distance. But craft unions, if you tend to focus on one job, so carpenters, electricians, plumbers, jobs that are actually true craft type jobs. Whereas industrial unions tend to cover broad, areas. So like the United Auto Workers, UAW, they cover anybody who works in an auto factory, or there's a lot of organizations like sport organizations that have like Major League Baseball has their own union, the National Football League has their own union. So sports, those are more industrial unions. So in your textbook, make sure you know the differences between craft unions and industrial unions and kind of the pros and cons of those. So, And then finally, the last thing that I want you to know for Chapter 1 is all about the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. It's the government agency that oversees, unionized work throughout the country. So, what are some of its practices? How do you get in front of the NLRB? What do they investigate? What do they do when they get involved? Kind of what is the overall function of the NLRB? What do they protect? What do they look at? What laws do they enforce? So make sure you kind of pay attention to what the NLRB itself does, because we'll reference the NLRB throughout this semester because so much of what they do focuses on unionization. So again, all of Chapter 1 is incredibly important, but if you can focus on those main topics, those are what I really want you to know for Chapter 1. Thanks so much, everyone.